The lake shimmered beneath the morning sun, a flawless mirror of still blue surrounded by pine and birch. My cabin stood alone on
Told
the
you to
eastern
stay
bank,
away from this
old
house.
cedar
Get
walls,
out
a
now before
wraparound
I have
deck,
them
and
arrest you for
silence so complete it
trespassing.
almost hummed. It was the kind of place where time didn't just slow down, it stopped. For years, it had been my escape from the constant noise of the city, and lately, from the venom of the homeowners, association that had tried to rule over everything I owned. The HOA wasn't supposed to have jurisdiction out here. The lake was private, my land clearly marked and recorded, my taxes paid, my deeds ironclad. But none of that mattered to her, Patricia Kane, the self-appointed president of the Silver Ridge HOA. She wasn't just a busybody. She was an empire builder in a floral blouse. She believed every inch of land within a mile radius fell under her command, and every person who disagreed was a threat to be crushed. For months she had harassed me through letters, phone calls, and code violations that never existed. She claimed my dock was illegal, that my cabin's paint color didn't meet community aesthetic standards. Even though the cabin wasn't in her community, I'd laughed at first. Then I realized she was serious. She called the county, she filed claims, and when none of that worked, she escalated. That morning the lake was quiet but not peaceful. There was a pressure in the air, thick, expectant. I'd arrived early, before sunrise, to prepare for a private meeting with someone whose arrival would change everything: the state attorney general. The attorney general had been investigating reports of rural property corruption across several counties. My case, it seemed, had become the missing puzzle piece in something much larger. The cabin was prepared meticulously. Files and photographs lay on the oak table. Documents of fraudulent HOA fees, embezzlement, and zoning manipulations, all traced back to Patricia and her inner circle. The evidence wasn't just solid, it was devastating. It was proof that this HOA wasn't just a nuisance, it was a criminal enterprise, extorting homeowners under the guise of neighborhood improvement. Outside, the hum of an approaching vehicle broke the stillness. It wasn't the Attorney General's convoy yet. It was smaller, older, its tires crunching on gravel like grinding teeth. Through the window I saw it, Patricia's white SUV. She wasn't supposed to be here. No one had told her about the meeting. She didn't know who was coming. The car door slammed. Birds scattered. Then the front gate rattled violently. Patricia was shouting, though her words were muffled by the walls. Her clipboard swung like a weapon in her hand as she stormed up the path, her face twisted with rage and entitlement. She decided, uninvited, to make a surprise inspection of a property that didn't belong to her. Inside, I didn't move. I watched from the window as she scanned the yard, eyes narrowing at the Attorney General's official SUV parked discreetly at the far side of the driveway. But she didn't see the tinted windows or the men inside. She saw only what she wanted: a challenge. Then came the breaking point, the sound of wood splintering as Patricia forced the latch on the door and pushed it open. She entered my cabin without knocking, without hesitation, the authority of arrogance leading her every step. She didn't know that at that very moment, the most powerful legal officer in the state was standing by the fireplace, silently watching her trespass. The moment froze, the door half open, Patricia's eyes flicking from the documents on the table to the unfamiliar faces in the room. Confusion bloomed, followed by dawning horror. She opened her mouth, but the Attorney General's voice cut through the silence, calm and razor-sharp. Though I said nothing, I watched her crumble from a self-proclaimed queen of control to a trespasser caught in the act. Outside, the sound of distant thunder rolled across the lake. The air had shifted, thick with electricity and consequence. The storm wasn't just coming, it had already arrived. Patricia's intrusion would trigger a chain reaction that no one in Silver Ridge could have predicted. Within hours, word would spread. Within days, subpoenas would be issued. And within weeks, everything she'd built through lies, fear, and control would fall apart in public view. But at that moment, inside that cabin, all that existed was silence and the weight of justice preparing to strike. The air inside the cabin had turned heavy, charged, almost suffocating. Patricia Kane, the queen of neighborhood tyranny, stood frozen in the doorway, her clipboard trembling slightly in her grip. The silence that followed her intrusion was louder than her shouting could ever have been. The state attorney general's team watched her with the kind of measured stillness that came only from experience, professionals who'd seen corruption unravel in real time before. She had no idea who these people were yet. To her, they were strangers in a home she believed she could control. But within seconds, realization began to dawn. She noticed the state seal embossed on a briefcase, the discreet earpieces, the calm authority in every movement. Her expression shifted, rage melting into disbelief, disbelief into fear. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the lake's surface into dark ripples. A storm was forming over the mountains, its distant rumble echoing the tension inside. The attorney general, tall and composed, turned to one of the investigators and gestured to the open door. Patricia's trespass had turned this meeting into something much larger. What was meant to be a private evidence review had just become the perfect live demonstration of abuse of power. Within the hour, the cabin was transformed into a command post. Agents unpacked files, scanners and cameras, documenting everything, from the broken latch on the front door to the digital records stored on my laptop. Patricia's presence had given them probable cause to expand their probe immediately. She was questioned, not with shouting or threats, but with surgical precision. Every attempt she made to assert authority only revealed more of her delusion. The team already had stacks of complaints from other residents of Silver Ridge. Hidden fees, forced liens, threats of foreclosure, falsified board elections. The list was endless. Patricia's HOA had built its empire on intimidation, bleeding homeowners dry one community improvement fee at a time. Her arrogance that morning had given the Attorney General exactly what was needed, a first-hand look at her disregard for property rights and law itself. By mid-afternoon, the storm outside broke open, rain slashing against the windows like applause from the heavens. Patricia was escorted out, her SUV searched under probable cause. The agents found binders, dozens of them, stuffed with records she'd been hiding. Inside, payment logs, lists of non-compliant homeowners, and internal memos revealing where the money really went. Tens of thousands in maintenance dues were being rerouted into personal accounts and fake vendors tied to her relatives. Each page turned was another nail in the coffin. The arrogance that once defined her had now become her undoing. The team didn't need to fabricate a case. They were handed one by the very woman who believed she was untouchable. As the hours passed, word began to leak. Residents texted, whispered, speculated. HOA board members started making panicked calls to lawyers. Some even drove to the lake to see what was happening, parking their cars along the tree line as unmarked state vehicles came and went. The entire community could feel it. The empire of fear that had ruled over them for years was cracking. When the Attorney General's team finally left that evening, the storm had quieted into a misty drizzle. The cabin was silent again, except for the steady ticking of rainwater dripping from the eaves. The evidence was gone, packed in secure cases and bound for the Capitol. But the weight of what had just happened remained, a quiet, immense shift. For me, the relief was mixed with disbelief. For months, I had been fighting back through letters, appeals, and silence. But in a single day, justice had stepped through my door, uninvited, yet perfectly timed. Patricia's intrusion had done what months of formal complaints could not. It had exposed her entire operation. That night, as I watched the last of the state vehicles disappear down the gravel road, the cabin lights flickered in the distance across the lake. Somewhere out there, the rest of the HOA board was realizing what was coming. The panic had begun to spread like wildfire. The next morning, headlines started appearing across state news networks. State launches investigation into corrupt HOA practices. Homeowners, rights violations under review. Silver Ridge Association under scrutiny for fraud. Patricia's name wasn't public yet, but those who knew her recognized the description instantly. Inside the HOA headquarters, a rented office suite that Patricia treated like her throne room, panic turned to chaos. Board members deleted emails, shredded papers, and whispered about damage control. But it was already too late. The state had frozen their accounts. Every financial record was being audited. Every false lien they'd placed was now evidence in a criminal investigation. And still, Patricia refused to believe it. She told anyone who would listen that it was all a misunderstanding, that the state had overreacted, that she was protecting the community. But deep down, she knew. The moment she stepped into my cabin without a warrant, without reason, without restraint, her empire had ended. In the following days, investigators interviewed dozens of residents, many of whom spoke for the first time in years. Stories poured out like floodwater of elderly homeowners bullied into paying illegal fees, of families threatened with foreclosure for planting the wrong flowers, of people driven to sell their homes out of fear. The pattern was undeniable. Patricia's HOA wasn't a governance body. It was a racket. By the end of the week, the state attorney's office had compiled enough to move forward with a full criminal probe. Arrest warrants were being drafted. Subpoenas were being signed. The web of corruption that had stretched across counties was beginning to unravel at the center. Back at the lake, I stood on the dock one evening as the sun dipped low over the water. The world was quiet again, but different now, charged with the aftertaste of justice. For the first time in years, I didn't feel watched. I didn't feel cornered. The fear that had crept into every part of our community was dissolving, replaced by something stronger: resolve. The storm had passed, but its aftermath was only beginning. Because as the state prepared its case, Patricia's allies were preparing something too: desperation moves, frantic cover-ups, and one last attempt to cling to control before the hammer came down for good. The investigation spread like fire through dry grass. By the start of the second week, Silver Ridge, a community once ruled by silence, was boiling with rumor, fear, and vindication. The HOA board that had once strutted through block parties and monthly meetings with smug smiles now hid behind drawn blinds and locked doors. Every one of them knew that Patricia Kane's downfall meant theirs was inevitable too. The state attorney general's office moved fast. What began as a localized trespassing incident had evolved into a statewide corruption probe. The deeper the investigators dug, the uglier it became. Fraudulent invoices, ghost contractors, illegal property seizures disguised as community enforcement. It wasn't incompetence, it was deliberate, systematic theft. Every spreadsheet led to another name. Every document uncovered another scam. Patricia had built her HOA into a personal empire of fear and greed, but she hadn't done it alone. Her vice president, a former real estate agent, had been falsifying home valuations to trigger unnecessary renovations, contracts that just happened to go to companies she owned. The treasurer, a man with no accounting degree but a fondness for administrative fees, had been laundering HOA funds into offshore accounts. And Patricia herself, she was the architect, the face of legitimacy behind a criminal machine. The state's forensic accountants traced every payment. Tens of thousands of dollars in fines, dues, and special assessment had been siphoned off each year. Some homeowners had been forced into foreclosure when they couldn't pay fees that were never lawful to begin with. Others had been intimidated into silence. But the investigators also discovered something else, something even darker. There were fake deeds, manipulated property lines, and zoning adjustments made under false signatures. Patricia hadn't just been extorting her neighbors. She'd been stealing their land on paper. Meanwhile, Patricia tried to maintain control, calling emergency meetings that nobody attended, issuing hollow statements about temporary administrative oversight, and insisting that the HOA was fully cooperating. But she knew her empire was collapsing. The whispers in the community had turned into open talk. People were coming forward, each story worse than the last. The victims, once terrified of retaliation, now felt protected under the shield of the state's investigation. Each day brought a new revelation. News channels ran constant updates, and online forums buzzed with leaked details. Reporters camped outside the Silver Ridge HOA office. Former board members began flipping on each other to save themselves. The illusion of authority that Patricia had worn for years was stripped away, replaced by raw panic. At the lake cabin, investigators continued their work. The Attorney General's team had set up a temporary field office nearby, gathering evidence not just from Silver Ridge but from neighboring communities where Patricia's influence had quietly spread. It became clear that her model HOA had been replicated in other developments, shell organizations, identical bylaws, and the same pattern of financial abuse. She had built a network of control that reached farther than anyone had realized. But justice, once in motion, was relentless. Subpoenas turned into indictments. Depositions turned into confessions. Patricia's closest allies started betraying her, each trying to shift blame before their own arrests. The mountain of evidence against her grew higher by the day, and still, Patricia refused to accept defeat. In the privacy of her sprawling lakefront home, she clung to her delusions of authority. She told herself she was the victim of a political witch hunt, that she had protected property values and kept order. But her version of order had always been built on fear. Now that fear was gone, and all that remained was the truth. In a last, desperate move, Patricia tried to rally support. She sent letters to homeowners, pleading for them to defend their community and stand against government overreach. But her words fell flat. The same people she had bullied and fined now saw her as what she truly was, a thief wrapped in the language of leadership. The state's investigation uncovered evidence that stretched back nearly a decade. Patricia had manipulated elections to keep herself in power, forged signatures to secure bank loans, and funneled money into her personal accounts under the label of beautification projects. Even her SUV, the one she drove to the cabin that morning, had been purchased with HOA funds. The Attorney General's team built the case piece by piece, careful and methodical. Every lie became a documented fact. Every abuse of power was listed in the indictment. What had once been rumors whispered over fences was now evidence in black and white. And yet, amid the chaos, the community began to heal. For the first time, residents held their own meetings, informal gatherings by the lake where people spoke without fear of fines or retaliation. They shared stories, planned to rebuild, and discussed restitution. They weren't just waiting for justice anymore. They were reclaiming their power. From my cabin deck, I watched those meetings unfold. It was poetic, seeing the same place that had sparked the investigation become the heart of a movement. The lake that had once been a symbol of isolation was now a symbol of unity. But the story wasn't over. Patricia's arrest was imminent, yet there were signs she was planning something reckless. Her lawyer had gone silent. Her accounts were frozen. And according to investigators, some key financial documents had vanished right before the state seized her office. She wasn't surrendering quietly. She was preparing for one last act of defiance. The storm that had started with her trespassing into my cabin wasn't done yet. It was building again, quieter this time, but far more dangerous. Because when cornered, power-hungry people don't fade away. They fight. The morning of Patricia Kane's downfall began deceptively calm. The lake lay still beneath a pale sky, mist curling off the surface like quiet breath. But beneath that calm, a storm was gathering, this time not of weather but of consequence. The investigation had reached its tipping point. The state had all it needed: the paper trail, the witnesses, the confessions. What remained was the moment everyone had been waiting for: the arrest. For days, Patricia had vanished from public view. Her once constant presence, her sharp voice at community meetings, her SUV parked at the HOA office like a badge of power, was gone. Her house stood dark at night, blinds drawn tight. Neighbors whispered that she was hiding evidence, burning files, or even planning to flee the state. None of it seemed impossible. The Attorney General's task force had monitored her every move. Satellite offices had been set up in nearby towns. The Silver Ridge HOA accounts had been frozen, its website taken down. Its so-called emergency board members had already turned themselves in, each bargaining for leniency by offering another piece of the puzzle. Patricia, however, refused to cooperate. But arrogance is a prison. It keeps the guilty from running when they should, from surrendering when they could. And Patricia Kane had built her entire identity around control. The thought of being powerless, of being ordinary, terrified her more than handcuffs ever could. The morning she fell, the Attorney General's office had already filed criminal charges: fraud, embezzlement, extortion, conspiracy, falsification of records, dozens of counts. The paperwork alone filled 2 thick binders. Her name sat at the top of every page in bold black print, the ink that would erase her empire. At 9:42 a.m., unmarked state vehicles rolled quietly into Silver Ridge. The neighborhood that had once trembled under her authority now stood still, curtains shifting as residents peeked out from behind them. They'd lived under her shadow for years, paying her illegal fees, obeying her fabricated rules, enduring her harassment. But now justice had arrived in broad daylight. Patricia was at her home office when they came for her. The knock on the door was polite, professional, and final. She opened it, trying to compose herself, dressed in the same floral blouse she'd worn to countless HOA meetings. But the moment she saw the badges, the composure cracked. She tried to speak, to argue, to claim she was the real victim, but the investigators had heard it all before. They read her rights, handcuffed her wrists, and led her out through the front yard that she had once patrolled like a queen guarding her kingdom. Cameras flashed from the street. Reporters, tipped off by early whispers, had gathered at the entrance of the gated community. The footage would later air across every local channel. The once feared HOA president, escorted past the Silver Ridge Welcomes You sign, eyes downcast, lips trembling. Inside the community, a strange mix of emotions rippled through the residents. Some cheered quietly. Others simply watched, stunned, unable to believe that it was truly over. The monster that had haunted their lives for years was finally gone. But for many, the moment carried something deeper, a release from years of fear, humiliation, and exhaustion. Back at the lake cabin, the Attorney General's lead investigator arrived to debrief. The operation had gone flawlessly. Patricia was in custody and her properties were being searched. Dozens of boxes of financial records were seized from her home, most of them marked with her distinctive handwriting, meticulous, controlling, obsessive. It turned out that even in her crimes, she couldn't resist documenting everything. Her need for order had made the case airtight. Over the following days, the dominoes fell one after another. Patricia's vice president was arrested for tax fraud. Her treasurer faced charges of money laundering. Even the county zoning officer, who had accepted bribes to manipulate boundary maps, was indicted. The web of corruption that had once seemed impenetrable was now a tangle of confessions and plea deals. The HOA, stripped of its leadership, was placed under state receivership. Investigators began the long process of untangling every fraudulent lien, every stolen dollar, every illegal judgment Patricia's board had issued. For the first time in years, homeowners began to receive letters not demanding payment, but offering restitution. The news spread far beyond Silver Ridge. Across the state, other communities began filing complaints against their own HOAs, emboldened by the example. The Attorney General's office launched a new task force focused solely on homeowner rights. What had started as a single act of arrogance, a trespass into a private cabin, had become a statewide reckoning. And yet, even as justice unfolded, Patricia Kane refused to admit guilt. From her holding cell, she continued to insist that everything she'd done had been for the good of the community. Her lawyer tried to argue that she'd been misguided, not malicious. But the evidence said otherwise. The numbers, the signatures, the victims, they told a story that no excuse could rewrite. Weeks later at the arraignment, she appeared pale and hollow. The courtroom was full. Residents, reporters, and the very people she had bullied for years sat behind the rail, watching in silence. When the judge read the list of charges, she stared ahead blankly, as if the words were in another language. The empire she had built on lies was now being dismantled, one charge at a time. Outside the courthouse, the Attorney General spoke briefly to the press. "This is not just about one HOA," he said. "It's about accountability. It's about reminding every person in power that authority is not ownership and governance is not domination." His words echoed far beyond the courthouse steps. At the lake that evening, the wind was calm again. The air smelled clean, unburdened. The ripples across the water caught the fatting sunlight like liquid gold. The cabin, once the scene of intrusion and chaos, now felt peaceful again, like a place that had done its part in restoring balance. Justice, it seemed, had a way of finding its way home, but even as Patricia's case moved toward trial, another storm loomed. The damage she'd caused, financial, emotional, and personal, ran deep. The cleanup would take months, maybe years. And while her reign had ended, the scars she left behind were still raw. The community was free but far from healed. And in the quiet that followed her fall, another question lingered. How do you rebuild trust after years of fear? The arrest of Patricia Kane sent shockwaves far beyond the boundaries of Silver Ridge. What had begun as a local scandal was now a statewide symbol of resistance against unchecked authority. The story dominated news cycles for weeks, headlines detailing her crimes, the victims, and the ripple effects of her downfall. But for those who had lived under her rule, the real story was what came after. Silver Ridge was broken, but alive again. The iron grip that had controlled it for nearly a decade was gone, and in its place came an unfamiliar sensation: freedom. For years, residents had whispered their frustrations in private, afraid to speak too loudly. Now they spoke openly, standing on their lawns, gathering at the lakeside, holding spontaneous meetings in driveways. The silence of fear had been replaced with the hum of rebuilding. The state-appointed receivers began their work swiftly. Financial audits revealed the staggering depth of Patricia's thefts, millions siphoned over the years under fake improvement projects and maintenance contracts. The findings were damning, but they also created something remarkable: a path to restitution. Every dollar recovered was earmarked for the homeowners she had exploited. Every lien she had filed under false pretenses was wiped clean. The first restitution checks arrived 2 months after Patricia's arrest. They were small at first, but symbolic, proof that the system could be made right again. Elderly couples who had once feared losing their homes now stood on their porches clutching envelopes that represented justice made tangible. The air felt lighter, the community brighter. At the same time, volunteers emerged, neighbors who had once been strangers. They repainted fences, repaired docks, and cut back the overgrown trails Patricia had neglected while pretending to care about aesthetic compliance. Even the lake seemed to reflect the change, its surface glimmering more vividly than before. The place that had been synonymous with control now pulsed with cooperation. The Attorney General's office maintained a visible presence during this recovery. Investigators returned frequently, not to interrogate but to assist. They helped residents form a legitimate, transparent association, one rooted in fairness and mutual respect rather than fear. It wasn't mandatory. It wasn't absolute. It was simply a structure designed to protect, not dominate. And through all of it, the lake cabin remained the silent witness, the place where the first domino had fallen. Officials came and went, occasionally stopping by for briefings or updates. The Attorney General himself visited once more, weeks after Patricia's sentencing hearing had been scheduled. Standing on the porch, he watched the sunlight ripple across the water and quietly acknowledged what everyone knew: that this quiet, private meeting place had become the epicenter of a revolution in accountability. But healing wasn't without pain. As the community tried to rebuild, the emotional scars began to surface. Some residents found it difficult to trust any leadership again. Others were consumed by anger, unable to forgive how easily they had been deceived. Homes that had once been battlefields of petty HOA wars now stood as quiet reminders of everything they had endured. Meetings turned into therapy sessions. People spoke about the harassment letters, the bogus fines, the fear of retaliation. One homeowner had nearly lost his house because Patricia had forged a lien notice. Another had been publicly shamed at a meeting for having non-compliant landscaping. Their stories poured out, one after another, until they realized how much collective pain they had carried alone. The state provided counseling resources and legal aid for victims of HOA fraud. Donations came in from across the country, strangers moved by the story of a community standing up to corruption. The once feared name, Silver Ridge, began to take on a new meaning, one associated not with greed and control, but with resilience and justice. And then came the trial. Patricia Kane appeared in court pale, smaller than anyone remembered her. Gone was the sharp authority, the commanding tone. What stood before the judge was a hollow echo of the woman who once dictated the color of mailboxes and the height of hedges. Her empire had crumbled, and now she stood surrounded by the evidence she had written herself, spreadsheets, contracts, and fraudulent documents, each one a record of her own undoing. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Witness after witness testified, recounting their experiences under her rule. There were tears, trembling voices, moments of rage barely held in check. Patricia never looked at them. When her sentence was finally read, 12 years in federal prison for fraud, embezzlement, and racketeering, the courtroom was silent. No one cheered. No one needed to. Justice had spoken, and the silence that followed was more powerful than applause. When it was over, she was led away without a word. The doors closed behind her, and with that sound, an era ended. In the following months, the Attorney General's task force expanded, investigating other HOAs across the state. Dozens of arrests followed. The case of Silver Ridge became a model for reform, proof that even the smallest acts of defiance could topple the tallest structures of corruption. For me, the cabin became something new. It was no longer a refuge from chaos, but a monument to what could happen when truth was given a voice. Papers that once lay across the oak table, the evidence that had ignited everything, were now archived in the state's Justice Department, sealed but immortalized. The community thrived again. Children played on docks that had once been restricted zones. Homeowners planted flowers without fear of fines. Neighbors smiled when they passed each other. For the first time in years, life felt normal, and that normalcy was its own victory. As autumn settled over the lake, the air carried the scent of pine and rain. The leaves turned gold and scarlet, their reflections flickering across the water. From the porch of the cabin, the world looked renewed. It had been broken, yes, but rebuilt stronger than before, proof that even under the heaviest hand of corruption, justice could still rise. But beneath the serenity, one truth lingered. Corruption, once exposed, never truly dies. It waits, it hides, it shifts. And though Silver Ridge had reclaimed its peace, the battle against those who wield power without conscience would always continue. Still, for now, the lake was calm, and the people who lived along its shores could finally breathe again. The seasons turned, and with them, so did Silver Ridge. The bitter memories of corruption and fear began to fade, replaced by something stronger: legacy. The scandal that had once consumed headlines now lived quietly in documentaries, news archives, and legal textbooks. The community itself, however, was no longer defined by its wounds, but by the way it had healed them. The lake, once a silent witness to greed and arrogance, now reflected life again. Every morning the fog lifted from its surface like an exhale, revealing fishermen casting lines, children skipping stones, and the rhythm of normal life restored. The water carried no echoes of intrusion, no shadow of trespass, only the steady pulse of peace earned through resilience. Patricia Kane's name had long since vanished from the HOA office signs, scrubbed from every board and file. Her imprisonment was final, and her power gone. Yet the consequences of her actions had reshaped far more than Silver Ridge. Across the state, communities began reevaluating their governance structures. State legislators drafted new homeowner protection laws, citing the Silver Ridge precedent as the turning point that had exposed decades of unmonitored abuse within homeowners associations. It wasn't just a legal shift, it was cultural. Homeowners who had once accepted intimidation as part of life began demanding transparency and fairness. The idea that HOA rules were law had been shattered, replaced by a new understanding that property rights and personal liberty were not privileges, they were protections. At the lake cabin, the place where it had all begun, the quiet returned, but it was a different kind of quiet, earned, dignified, purposeful. The state attorney general had visited one final time after Patricia's sentencing, not as an investigator but as a guest. The visit was brief and symbolic. He had stood at the edge of the dock, looking across the water, and said only one thing before leaving: "Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the silence that follows." Those words stayed with me long after he was gone. The cabin itself became a symbol. Journalists referred to it as the place where justice knocked back. Locals called it the lake that broke the crown. Over time, it became a quiet landmark, not a tourist spot but a place of reflection. Law students, homeowners, and activists visited occasionally, standing by the water's edge to imagine the moment the tables had turned, when power met accountability head-on. And for those who lived around the lake, life carried on. Homes once painted in HOA-approved beige were now bright with individuality, reds, blues, greens, and yellows. Fences that had been torn down under non-compliance rules were rebuilt, not to divide but to decorate. The community that had once lived in fear of letters and fines now thrived under mutual respect. Neighbors waved, barbecues returned, and laughter replaced the anxiety that used to hover over every gathering. Each restitution check sent from the state marked another closure, another home restored, another life repaired. People who had once whispered about selling and leaving began investing again, planting gardens, repainting porches, reclaiming what was theirs in both spirit and name. From the cabin porch, the view changed too. Where Patricia's intruding footsteps had once broken the stillness, now only the sound of lapping water and the occasional loon filled the air. The door she had forced open was long repaired, its new latch polished and firm, a small, simple symbol of what had been reclaimed. As winter arrived, snow blanketed the land in silence. The lake froze into glass, holding the reflection of pine trees and a sky heavy with peace. In that stillness, the memory of what had happened there felt both distant and alive. It wasn't just a story of revenge, it was one of redemption. The community had not only taken back what was stolen, it had built something stronger in its place. And beyond the borders of Silver Ridge, other communities watched and learned. The Silver Ridge model became a movement. Across the country, homeowners began to question, to audit, to hold their HOAs accountable. Laws changed. Oversight boards were created. What had begun with a single act of trespass by one corrupt woman had ignited a wave of reform that reached far beyond the lake. Patricia Kane would serve her sentence in silence, but her legacy was one she could never control. The legacy of being the example, the warning, the cautionary tale told in every courtroom and town hall where power threatened to eclipse fairness. And yet, even as her name faded, another legacy grew brighter, the legacy of courage, of a community that refused to be silent, of a single homeowner who stood his ground and a meeting that was never supposed to be interrupted. Years later, when the cabin's cedar walls had aged to a soft gray and the pine needles carpeted the shore, the story of that day still lingered in the air. Not as anger, not as fear, but as history, a reminder that no one, no matter how entitled or powerful, stands above justice. The lake still mirrored the sky. The community still thrived. And though storms would come and go, the people of Silver Ridge had learned something unshakable, that peace built on truth can weather any storm. And beneath that endless reflection of sky and water, justice slept, calm, eternal, and unchallenged.